To solve a quadratic like this, using completing the square, there's a special technique that I like to use. The first thing that I always like to do is go ahead and get my constant over to the other side. Therefore, I can just focus in on creating the perfect square trinomial on one side of the equation. Okay, now there is a couple different techniques. I do also work on factoring out terms, but I typically like to focus on that when I'm graphing a quadratic using completing the square. The main important thing you need to recognize when you need to complete the square, we don't like the 3. We don't like coefficients, and we cannot complete the square when we have a coefficient. So there's 2 ways to get rid of it. One way is to divide out that by every single term, which is the way that we're going to use. And the other way is to go ahead and factor out the 3, which I like to use when we are graphing a quadratic by completing the square. But for this video, let's go ahead and see what is going to happen when I divide everything by a 3. And unfortunately, we just created some fractions. And if you're like most of my students, that probably is getting a little bit uncomfortable because you're like, I don't want to do problems with fractions. I don't like fractions. Fractions make me uncomfortable. But it's okay, because you know what? I'm doing the problem. You can just sit back and enjoy, and I will work through how to do this step by step. But we don't like fractions. Fractions make everything more difficult. Remember, the whole idea of completing the square and getting that 8 to the other side is because we need to create a perfect square trinomial of m squared plus 8/3 m. Yeah, we need to create a perfect square trinomial out of that. So what we need to do is we need to find a value c that is going to create that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the value c here just so we can visualize it. And remember, whatever you do to the left-hand side, you also have to make sure you do to the right-hand side. So that is our value c. C is very, very important. C is going to be the value that is going to create a perfect square trinomial. Now again, why do we want to create a perfect square trinomial? Because perfect square trinomials can be factored down to binomial squared. That is going to allow us to use our inverse operations. That's how we can avoid using factoring to solve this. So we're using the process of completing the square. We're going to create a perfect square trinomial. So what is the value c? C, or how do we find the value c? That's going to be b divided by 2 squared. Remember, b is just going to be the coefficient of your linear term. Now, here's the important thing. We have 8/3 as our b. That means 8/3 is going to be divided by 2 and then square it. And if you're like me, or if you're like a lot of my students, this is where students make the mistakes. So rather than kind of breezing over this and talking really fast and just giving the answer, I'm going to go through this step by step because I don't want you to make a mistake like I would if I was teaching, or sometimes when I was a student and I was taking a test. I just tried to do things as quickly as I could. So let's break this down. I have an 8/3 divided by 2, quantity squared. Now, if I want to simplify this, typically what I always like to do is think about my divisor and put it as a 2/1. Therefore, I can get rid of this 2 by multiplying by the reciprocal on the top and on the bottom. Now, you could multiply straight across, but also I want you to recognize 2 divides into 8. So I can simplify that to a 4. So technically, we can rewrite this as a 4/3 squared. That's going to be the most simplified fraction. Remember when you were first learning about fractions, your teachers, were always like, simplify, simplify, simplify. Maybe you get like points off because you didn't simplify and you're like, wow, I got the right answer, but it's not simplified, which is a different argument for a different day. But I think it's really, really important. I first did this problem when I didn't look for the simplified process, and I got the same answer, but it was a lot more difficult because I was working with bigger numbers. Simplifying is so important because it just makes, if you're able to simplify it, it makes your life and the math that you're doing a lot easier than if you didn't simplify it. So I have a 4/3 squared. Remember, that's just 4/3 times 4/3. So that's going to give me a 16/9. Okay, that is my c, right? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, that is the c. So now what we can do is I can replace my c over here with a 16/9. All right, so now that I've created the 16/9, I need to factor this down. One of the things that I want you to understand is rather than trying to factor this, like what 2 numbers multiply to give you 16/9, the add to give you an 8/3, nobody's thinking of that. Here's a little special technique you guys can use. X plus or minus a b divided by 2, quantity squared, is always going to be your binomial squared from a perfect square trinomial. I did plus or minus because if your middle term is positive, your binomial is going to be positive. If your middle term was negative, your binomial will be negative. So what was my b divided by 2? That was 4/3. So therefore, I can rewrite this as a m plus, because its middle term is positive, 4/3 quantity squared. And then over here, you can see that I don't have equivalent fractions, so I can't add them. However, I can simply just multiply by 2/2, and that's going to give me a, no, not a 2/2. What am I doing? A 3/3, right? So now therefore that's going to be 9. That's going to give me a 24. So 24 plus 16, let's see, that's going to give me a 30. That's going to give me a 40, right? Yes. So that's going to equal a 40 over a 9. So now all I simply need to do, and again, the purpose and the point of doing this is now I only have one term. So, and you can see I have these operations. I have it squared, and then I'm adding a 4/3. So to solve for this, all I simply need to do now is take the square root of both sides. That is now going to leave me with m plus a 4/3 is equal to, let's go ahead and simplify the square root of 40. That can be broken down into a 4 times 10, which is equal to a 2 square root of 10. And then the square root of 9, I can leave that as a 3. So therefore a 2 square root of 10 divided by 3. And don't forget that's a plus or minus. And then I just need to subtract a 4/3. So I can write my answer nice and neat to look like this.